November 30th, 1942. 2:14 a.m. Ironbottom Sound, Guadalcanal. The order crackled through the intercom of PT 109. Cut the engines. Go silent. For Robert Bobby Chen, 22 years old, it was a moment that would define the rest of his life. His hands, which had spent the last 9 months maintaining the boat's 3 massive V12 Packard engines, froze on the throttle. He knew the consequences of the order he was about to follow. Chen's mind raced, but his body didn't move. He was stuck in that moment, gripped by the realization that cutting the engines was the only way forward, even if it meant they were now a sitting target. The boat's 3 powerful engines, capable of producing a combined 4,500 horsepower, had been the lifeblood of the PT 109. But now, those engines were no longer their salvation. They were a death sentence. Just 800 yards away, a Japanese destroyer was speeding toward them through the pitch-black water at 30 knots, its massive guns aimed directly at PT 109. If they kept the engines running, the Japanese would hear them from miles away. If they cut the engines, they were sitting ducks. There was no escaping it. This was the decision that would determine whether they lived or died. But for Bobby Chen, this wasn't just another life-or-death moment. It was the culmination of a journey filled with loss, frustration, and the pain of watching friends die. Just weeks earlier, his best friend Tommy Morrison had died in a PT boat attack after the engines had announced their position to the Japanese from miles away. That death had haunted Chen, and now, faced with the same challenge, he realized the truth. The speed that American PT boats relied on wasn't enough. It was the noise of the engines, the very thing that gave them their speed, that had been killing them. He could hear the faint sound of the Japanese destroyer's engines drawing closer. In that instant, Chen knew something had to change. It wasn't about going faster. It was about going quieter. And with that, Bobby Chen, a mechanic, not a tactician, had an idea that would change naval warfare forever. The Pacific War was defined by speed, or rather, the lack of it. For American PT boats, the mantra was clear: use speed. It was the key to survival, the advantage that set the small, wooden boats apart from the heavily armed Japanese destroyers that prowled the waters of the Solomon Islands. The faster they moved, the harder they were to hit, or so they thought. But by November of 1942, the truth had become undeniable. Speed alone wasn't enough. In fact, it was killing them. Chen had seen it firsthand. Over the last 8 weeks, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had lost 12 boats and their crews. The number kept climbing, and every time, the reason was the same. The Japanese knew they were coming. They heard the engines, the Packard V12S, roaring at full throttle, cutting through the water with such force that it was impossible to miss. The Japanese hydrophones picked up the sound of the engines from miles away, and from that moment, the chase was on. The PT boats were fast, sure, but the Japanese were ready for that. Every single time, they anticipated the attack, calculated the bearing, and opened fire before the American boats could even reach them. And when the PT boats tried to flee, trying to outrun the inevitable, it only made them easier targets. The sound of the engines would give them away, marking them as prey. The speed that was supposed to be their salvation was now their doom. Chen knew that better than anyone. He had witnessed it in the worst way possible. His best friend, Tommy Morrison, was gone because of it. Just 3 weeks earlier, Morrison had been aboard PT-44, one of the fastest boats in the squadron. They'd trained together in Rhode Island, bunked together at Tillage, and shared dreams of opening a motorcycle repair shop together after the war. But none of those dreams would come to pass. On November 8th, PT-44 launched an attack on a Japanese destroyer convoy at 35 knots. The Japanese heard them coming from 4 miles away, opened fire at 2 miles, and PT-44 was torn apart by a direct hit. The explosion was instantaneous. The fire that followed consumed the boat, and by the time rescue boats arrived, there was nothing left to recover. Chen had been on the shore that day. He watched the flames reflected in the water, the searchlights scanning the wreckage for survivors, but there were none. Morrison was gone. He'd died because the engines, the very thing that had made them fast, had made them visible. That lesson stayed with Chen. The louder the engines roared, the easier it was for the Japanese to track them. That night, as Chen lay awake in his bunk, his mind raced. He replayed every engagement report he had read, every after-action brief he had studied. The pattern was always the same. American PT boats would race toward the Japanese, destroyers at top speed. The Japanese would hear the engines from miles away, track their bearing, and open fire before the boats even had a chance to launch torpedoes. It was a cycle of failure, and it was one that had claimed far too many lives. But Chen, who had been around engines all his life, saw something others didn't. He had worked in his father's motorcycle shop back in Oakland, learning to diagnose problems by sound before he could even read a manual. He could hear the subtle differences in the pitch of an engine, the way the exhaust sounded, the rhythm of the pistons. He had a gift for understanding machines, and it wasn't lost on him that the PT boat's engines, despite being powerful, were also a massive weakness. Chen wasn't the type to sit idly by, waiting for the solution to fall into his lap. He started spending his nights off the boat, reading through the mission logs, searching for a way to break the cycle. And as he read, a thought began to take shape in his mind, something nobody else had considered. What if the problem wasn't the speed? What if the problem was the noise? He'd noticed something strange while working on PT-109's port engine. It had been a minor coolant leak, nothing that would have caused alarm. But while swimming under the boat, checking the hull for cracks, he'd heard something unusual. When the engines were idling not at full throttle, but just enough to keep them running, the sound was deafening. The underwater world had been silent at first, the gentle movement of the water and distant sounds of fish swimming beneath the boat. But as soon as the engine turned over, the roar was overwhelming. It was low frequency, deep, and rumbled through the water like thunder. Even underwater, the vibrations rattled his teeth. The noise was so intense, it felt like standing next to a freight train. Chen surfaced and treading water. He thought about what he'd just heard. When the engines were off, he could hear everything. The sounds of the water, the movement of the fish, the creaking of distant boats. But with the engines on, even at idle, the noise was so intense it drowned out all else. That was when the idea struck him. What if they cut the engines entirely? What if, instead of racing toward the target, they drifted in silence? The thought was crazy. No one in their right mind would abandon the doctrine that had been drilled into their heads from day one. Stay mobile, stay fast, never stop, never become a stationary target. But every PT boat that followed those rules had ended up sunk or crippled. Chen didn't share his thoughts with anyone immediately. It seemed too risky, too insane to even entertain. But in the back of his mind, he knew he had to try it at least once before more men died. For weeks, Bobby Chen had kept his discovery to himself, a secret he couldn't fully believe, let alone share. The idea of cutting the engines and drifting silently into the heart of enemy territory was madness, wasn't it? Every protocol, every textbook on PT boat tactics said the same thing. Speed is survival. It was drilled into the very core of every sailor's being. Go fast, stay mobile, and never, under any circumstances, allow yourself to become a stationary target. But Chen couldn't shake the thought. He spent long nights aboard PT-109, staring at the boat's engines, listening to the hum and growl of the Packards, and every time that idea crept back into his mind. What if he was right? What if the only way to survive was to do the exact opposite of everything they had been taught? The answer came during an off-duty moment, as Chen continued to work on the boat. PT-109 had pulled into an area for a routine maintenance check. While the crew went about their repairs, Chen couldn't help but slip into the water once again, a habit that had started when he had been checking for leaks. This time, however, he was listening more intently. He dove beneath the boat, his head submerged in the cool water. Above him, the boat floated silently, its engines idling. The familiar hum was there, but this time he was more attuned to it. Below the surface, he heard what he had missed before. The sound was loud, too loud, a deep, rumbling roar that reverberated through his chest and skull. It wasn't just the noise that disturbed him, it was the realization that the noise traveled for miles underwater, carrying the unmistakable signature of an American PT boat. But when the engines were off, it was a different world entirely. Below the surface, everything was different. The silence was profound. He could hear the fish swimming, the gentle slapping of the water against the hull, the occasional distant sounds of other boats, but none of it was intrusive. The contrast was striking. It was as if the world above and below were two entirely separate realities. Chen surfaced again, his heart racing. The gears in his mind turned faster than they ever had before. He had been right. The engines, even at idle, made them vulnerable. But when the engines were silent, when the boat was still, they were nearly invisible. For the first time in weeks, he felt a surge of hope. Maybe this crazy idea of his could actually work. The question remained, what if they tried it? What if they cut the engines completely and drifted in silence, instead of racing toward the target? Chen didn't immediately share his findings with anyone, but he did make a decision the next time they had a break in the patrol schedule, he would try it himself. No orders, no permission, just a test. A theory. It was late one evening when Chen decided to test his theory. The boat had completed a minor maintenance run, and the crew was busy with routine tasks. He quickly slipped away, made his way down to the engine room, and cut the engines. The silence that followed was both eerie and exhilarating. The boat continued drifting, moving gently with the current, but the only sound now was the soft slap of waves against the wooden hull. There were no engines to betray their position, there was no noise to give them away. For the first time in his life aboard a PT boat, Chen felt a strange sense of control. As PT-109 drifted, Chen listened intently, searching for any sign that their absence of noise was being detected. For what seemed like an eternity, there was nothing. No sonar ping, no approaching destroyer, just silence. Chen pulled himself from beneath the boat and scrambled back onto the deck. He looked out over the water, wondering if his ears were playing tricks on him. The quiet was overwhelming. But that was the key, wasn't it? The idea he had thought of so many times, that crazy idea of turning off the engines and drifting, was now a reality. The question was no longer whether it would work. The question was if it was worth the risk. That night, as the crew gathered for dinner, Chen could no longer keep the secret. He found Morrison sitting by the edge of the boat, looking out at the horizon. The sun had just set, and the water was bathed in a soft orange glow. Morrison had always been easy to talk to, always ready with a joke or a story about his plans for the future. Chen sat down beside him, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Morrison, I think I figured it out. I think I found a way we can avoid the Japanese sonar." Morrison raised an eyebrow, flicking his cigarette into the water. "You think we can outrun them?" "No," Chen replied. "I think we can out-silence them." Morrison stared at him for a moment, as if waiting for the punchline. But when none came, he sat back, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "You think we should just turn off the engines and float toward Japanese destroyers?" Chen nodded, his voice low. I think we should try it before more guys die. Morrison looked at him, the cigarette dangling between his fingers. He took another drag and exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. Chen, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. Chen didn't back down. He had already lost too many friends, too many good men, to the same failed tactics. I know, he said, but you might be right. I think it's the only chance we've got. Morrison flicked ash into the water and looked down at his boots. If I die before you get a chance to test it, promise me you'll try it anyway. Chen hesitated, then nodded solemnly. I promise. Morrison didn't say anything else. He simply stared at the water, lost in thought. Chen did the same, knowing that what he was about to suggest was madness. But it was madness that might just save them all. November 30th, 1942. The night had settled in thick and heavy over Ironbottom Sound. PT-109 sat silently on the water, its engines cut, its crew on edge, their breath shallow in the cool night air. Bobby Chen stood in the engine room, listening to the silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was about to do, what they were about to do. The boat had never operated this way before. No one had ever dared to try it. The lieutenant's voice crackled over the intercom again, breaking the tension. Cut the engines. Execute silent running. Don't make a sound unless I give the order. This was the moment. There was no going back now. Chen's stomach dropped. For the first time since joining the PT boat squadron, he wasn't just worried about their mission, he was worried about their survival. He hadn't trained for this. No one had. Silent running had never been a part of their tactics. They had been taught to charge in fast, to attack hard, and to flee even harder. But now they were going against everything they had learned. Chen's hands moved to the throttles, his fingers trembling as they grasped the levers. Slowly, he pulled them back, turning down the roar of the engines. The sound that had always been so familiar to him, the sound of speed and power, faded into a low hum. The boat's vibration, once deafening, started to dissipate. The powerful engines slowed until they were barely ticking over, just enough to keep the boat from stalling. The silence was profound. Chen could hear the wind, the faint creak of wood, and the soft slap of the water against the hull. He held his breath, listening, waiting. The boat drifted forward under momentum alone, moving slowly, eerily quiet, toward the Japanese destroyer that had no idea they were even there. The destroyer loomed ahead, just 800 yards away. Chen could see its silhouette against the faint sky. The metal beast glided through the water, its engine thrumming steadily, but it had no idea that an American PT boat was silently drifting toward it, invisible in the darkness. For a moment, Chen couldn't believe what was happening. He looked around at the crew. They were as still as he was, frozen in place, holding their breaths. They were waiting to see if this insane idea would work, or if it would be the last thing they ever did. With every passing second, PT-109 inched closer to the destroyer. 700 yards. 600 yards. Chen's hands were shaking, gripping the edge of the engine mount for stability. His coveralls were soaked in sweat, despite the cool night air. The crew remained silent, each of them knowing that one wrong move, one sound, could destroy everything. But the Japanese destroyer? It didn't hear them. The ship's crew was too busy moving about the deck, oblivious to the tiny boat that was creeping closer. The searchlights swept across the water in wide arcs, cutting through the darkness, but they missed PT-109 entirely. The crew remained as still as statues, eyes locked on the destroyer. They could see the gunners, the officers on the deck, completely unaware of their presence. Chen's heart raced in his chest, and with each passing second, the silence seemed to grow heavier. The idea that had seemed so ridiculous, so impossible, was now real. He had proven that it was possible to be invisible on the water if only they could hold their nerve long enough. 400 yards, 300 yards. PT 109 was now within striking distance. The Japanese destroyer was still moving forward, oblivious to the danger that was closing in. Chen could hear the faint thrum of the destroyer's engines, but his own boat remained dead silent. The noise of the world around him seemed to fade as he focused entirely on the destroyer. Every second counted now. The closer they got, the more nerve-wracking it became. The lieutenant's voice came through the intercom again, soft and calm. "Torpedoes, fire tubes 1 and 2. Chen's heart skipped a beat. This was it. His hands moved quickly to the controls. He could feel the boat's momentum slowing, but it was enough. With a steady hand, he launched the first 2 torpedoes, one after the other. They slipped into the water without a sound, running hot and straight toward their target. The destroyer was now close enough that Chen could see the details on its hull, the massive guns, the sailors moving about the deck. Everything was perfectly clear. And yet, they hadn't been heard. The destroyer was still unaware of the threat that was bearing down on it. Chen counted in his head as the seconds ticked by. 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 40 seconds. Then came the explosion. The first torpedo hit the destroyer's port side, right at the engine room, and the explosion was nothing short of catastrophic. Chen felt the shockwave, even at his position, 300 yards away. The entire boat shuddered under the force of it. Orange fireballs erupted from the destroyer's hull. Metal screamed, and the ship lurched violently as it started to take on water. Chen's mind raced, but there was no time to think. The second torpedo struck just seconds later, hitting the same side of the ship, right where the first had. The destroyer was sinking, its engines failing, and the crew was in chaos. The Japanese sailors had no chance. They hadn't even known PT 109 was there until it was too late. The destroyer, now crippled, was slowly sinking into the dark waters of Ironbottom Sound. The Japanese crew scrambled, abandoning ship, diving into the cold ocean, but it was all too late. The damage was done. The destroyer was dying, and PT 109 had made it out unscathed. Chen slammed the throttles forward, revving the Packard engines to full power. The boat surged forward, its engines roaring back to life, cutting through the water at 40 knots. The crew erupted into cheers, shouting and celebrating as they watched the Japanese destroyer burn, its hull listing and sinking in the distance. But Chen wasn't cheering. He wasn't celebrating. His thoughts were elsewhere. As the boat sped away from the wreckage, he couldn't shake the nagging thought that had been with him for weeks. This could change everything. For the first time, the PT boats had taken down a Japanese destroyer without giving their position away. No engines, no noise, no detectable sound, just silence. And in that silence, they had struck. The success of that night was nothing short of revolutionary. When PT 109 returned to base, the crew was greeted with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The Japanese destroyer they had attacked had sunk in a fireball of destruction, but more importantly, it had been done without any of the traditional telltale signs of an American PT boat. No deafening engine roar, no wake cutting through the water, no engine noise to be picked up by Japanese sonar. For the first time, a PT boat had struck without being detected. The victory wasn't just a fluke. It was proof of a theory that had started as a whisper in Bobby Chen's mind, a theory that no one, not even the highest-ranking officers, had thought worth pursuing. But it had worked. And now, as the crew of PT 109 celebrated their narrow escape, Chen knew that something bigger had just begun. By the next morning, the word was already spreading across the fleet. PT 109's daring and seemingly insane tactic had worked, and now others wanted to try it. The very idea that cutting the engines and drifting silently was not only possible but effective was catching fire. The tactics manual didn't include it. In fact, it directly contradicted the fundamental rules of PT boat warfare. Yet, after what Chen had just done, it was clear the old rules no longer applied. In the days that followed, Chen briefed his fellow mechanics, explaining the technique he had developed, cutting the engines at 800 yards, drifting silently toward the target until reaching 400 yards, then launching torpedoes before firing up the engines and fleeing at full speed. It was risky. There were no guarantees that the engines would restart in time or that the boat wouldn't be spotted by searchlights, but it was a hell of a lot better than charging in with engines, screaming and giving away their position from miles away. The other mechanics were skeptical at first, as anyone would be when faced with a tactic that went against everything they had been trained to do. One of the younger men from Texas, a mechanic named Rodriguez, voiced what everyone was thinking. "You want us to turn off the engines and float toward destroyers? That's suicide." Chen, however, wasn't deterred. He had seen too many good men die by following the traditional tactics. "We're dead anyway if we keep doing what we've been doing," he shot back. "The Japanese can hear us from 3 miles away. We have no chance. But this gives us a chance." Rodriguez didn't have a better solution. He didn't have anything to offer that hadn't already been tested and failed. Slowly, the other mechanics began to realize that Chen's idea, crazy as it sounded, might be the only shot they had left. Within hours, they had agreed to try it, just like Chen had, against all odds, tested it himself. The word spread even further. By December 1st, just a few days after the successful attack, the silent running tactic was no longer confined to PT 109. It was being implemented across the fleet as more and more squadrons came together and began to practice cutting the engines, drifting silently, and firing torpedoes without ever being detected. Chen's theory had been put to the test, and it had worked. It had worked because it exploited a fundamental weakness in the Japanese destroyers' strategy. They were so used to hearing American boats coming at high speed that they never anticipated silence. The Japanese began to notice the change, too. They had always relied on their superior sonar systems to detect PT boats long before they ever came close enough to launch a successful attack. But now, in the Solomons, their once reliable sonar systems were failing them. For the first time, they were facing American PT boats that were like ghosts in the night, silent, invisible, and deadly. By December 5th, the tactic was no longer a novelty. It had become standard operating procedure. Silent running was no longer the exception, it was the rule. American PT boats had adopted it across the Pacific, and it was proving effective everywhere. Squadrons were practicing it nightly, coordinating their movements and ensuring they followed the precise steps Chen had outlined. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare. They could no longer hear American boats coming. They couldn't track their position. They couldn't even anticipate their attack. In response, Japanese destroyers began to refuse night operations unless they had air cover. The Tokyo Express, the supply route the Japanese had relied on for so long, was starting to fail. Not because the Americans were faster or better armed, but because they had learned to become silent. And the Japanese, who had always relied on their ability to hear the Americans coming, were now caught in the dark. The change was dramatic. Reports from Japanese naval officers described how American boats had become like ghosts, silent and impossible to detect until it was too late. They didn't understand how it worked. They thought the Americans had somehow developed stealth technology or quieter engines. They never once considered that the answer was far simpler. American sailors had figured out how to turn the engines off. Back at PT 109's base, Chen could hardly believe what he was hearing. His idea, the one that had seemed so insane just days earlier, had turned into a fleet-wide revolution. But Chen wasn't celebrating. He didn't care about recognition, about accolades, or about the fame that some of the other men might have craved. What mattered to him was that the crews were surviving. Fewer boats were sinking. Fewer men were dying. For the first time in weeks, Chen felt like they had a chance. He had stopped them from making the same mistake again and again. And even if no one else knew it, he knew the truth. His idea had saved their lives. The months following the successful implementation of silent running were a time of unprecedented success for the American PT boats in the Solomon Islands. Silent running had quickly become the go-to tactic, and its success was undeniable. By the end of December, Japanese destroyers were refusing to enter Ironbottom Sound without air cover. The once feared Tokyo Express, the fleet of supply ships and destroyers that had maintained a steady stream of support to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, was failing. Not because of speed or superior firepower, but because the PT boats had learned the most dangerous trick of all: silence. But while the strategy was spreading like wildfire through the Pacific, Bobby Chen's name was still nowhere to be found in official reports. The U.S. Navy's credit for the innovation went to operational squadrons in the South Pacific, and while Chen's breakthrough was now the standard, the man who had made it possible had slipped into obscurity. There was no medal for him, no public recognition, no mention of his name in the briefings that followed. The Navy's formal records only made a brief mention of a maintenance log entry from December 2nd, 1942. To Chen, "Our advised engine shutdown protocols for noise reduction. Effective." That was it. One line, in a logbook, buried beneath hundreds of other reports. The man who had revolutionized PT boat tactics and saved countless lives had been erased from history. But among the men who had served alongside him, there was no question about who had changed the course of the war for them. Every mechanic who had learned the silent running technique knew who had been responsible. Chen had made it possible for them to survive. Without his ingenuity, without his decision to test his theory, without his willingness to risk everything, many of them would not have made it back. Chen's legacy lived on quietly in the memories of the men he had saved. In late December, after a victorious engagement where several Japanese destroyers were sunk, one of Chen's fellow mechanics, a veteran from Squadron 3, gave a short speech at a memorial service for those lost in combat. The words were simple but powerful. Bobby Chen never wanted credit, never asked for recognition. He just wanted us to stop dying. We came home because he figured out how to make us quiet. That's all that mattered to him, that we came home. But even that tribute didn't come soon enough for Chen. He never sought the spotlight, never wanted the accolades. For him, it was about one thing: keeping his men alive. After the war, he returned to Oakland, opened a motorcycle shop with his brother, and lived a quiet life. He never spoke about his contribution to the PT boat's success. His daughters didn't even learn about his role until 1989, when a naval historian tracked him down to ask about the silent running tactic. Chen's answer was humble and to the point. "I just noticed we were loud. Seemed stupid to announce ourselves to every Japanese ship within 5 miles. Somebody had to try turning the engines off." Chen's story didn't make headlines. His name didn't appear in any of the major histories of World War II. But to the men who served with him, to the mechanics who learned his technique, and to the thousands of sailors who survived because of it, Bobby Chen was a hero. And his legacy lives on in every ship that still uses silent running today, in the sonar protocols that modern warships follow, and in the quiet ingenuity that saved so many lives during the darkest days of the war. Chen died in 2003 at the age of 83 of heart failure. His obituary mentioned his Navy Cross, his service aboard PT boats, and his contributions to the war effort. But it didn't mention the silent running tactic. It didn't mention the lives saved. It didn't mention the man who had figured out, when all the experts had failed, that sometimes the craziest idea is the only one that works. And so, in the PT Boat Museum in Fall River, Massachusetts, there's a small placard that reads, "Silent Running Protocol, developed by Chief Machinist, Mate Robert Chen, 1942. A humble tribute to a man whose brilliance saved hundreds of lives and who never sought anything in return." The world may not remember Bobby Chen the way it remembers other heroes of World War II, but the men who served beside him will never forget. And now, thanks to this story, you know his name, too. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about forgotten heroes. Subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. These men deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us you were here. Our community stretches across the world. You're not just watching, you're keeping these memories alive. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for making sure Bobby Chen doesn't disappear into silence.